So looking at the syntax bindings, this is like how it's often being presented, at least in our slides here from these webinars. If you've been before, you've probably seen this. We have on the left side the semantic data model. On the right side, we have the two syntaxes. And for each element in the semantic model, we have a pointer to the specific location in the syntax where to map this element. Looks pretty straightforward. Perhaps it's not really as straightforward as it looks in reality, but this is how it's often presented. And if we open up the technical specifications for the syntax bindings, they will look, the main part of the specification are tables like this. That on the left side you have the business terms, the cardinality, and the description. And then on the right side we have the X path, so that is the location in the XML document, and then the cardinality of the syntax, and also a comment where there are differences in how to since the semantics used by the syntax might in some cases slightly deviate from the European standards in the norm, then there are some clarifications. So for example, the invoice type code, that's a mandatory element in the semantic model, while in UBL the type code is optional. So then based on that, there is also a validation rule that makes this element mandatory, so it tests that it's actually being used. So the schema says it's optional, but we've added syntax validation rules to validate that it actually exists. So, but this is like half the specification is built up like this, the other half is in the other direction. So depending on what your starting point is, it can be useful to have this table ordered according to the location of the elements in the syntax rather than in the model. Specifically, if you are looking at the schema and you want to see for a specific element where in the model is it used. But it's essentially the same information. It's not a simple pair matching game. You know, when the picture I had in the beginning with the model on the left side and then the dotted line to the right, it's not really as simple as that. Often business terms are mapped to a whole structure. So it may be that qualifiers are necessary. So in the syntax there might be a very generic element, while in the data model there is a very specific element. And so to map, there's also need to be qualification codes, for example. So that is one situation. I will give you an example of that in a moment. Also, the syntaxes have different structures. They have different order of the elements than the semantic model. And they may have different cardinalities, as I mentioned, and even data types. So most of these differences are regulated by additional validation rules. Some of the differences have no real consequence on the usage, because if the elements are in a different order, it doesn't really matter. But it can confuse perhaps first-time readers. So here's an example. On the left side, we have the semantic model, or a depiction of it. On the right side, we have the cross-industry invoice schema. In the cross-industry invoice schema, we have the invoice line expanded all to the right. And if we take a look at how this is mapped, very, very high level, we can see that the invoice note element that is mapped to an element within the exchange document section. The process control is within the exchange document context section of the schema. This can, of course, be expanded. I mean, I was pointing this on a high level. The seller is located under the applicable header trade agreement section, And under that section, all the parties are related to the agreement by the buyer and seller are located. And the invoice line is above. So as you see, the order of the syntax elements are completely different from the semantic model, but it has no real impact on the actual usage. So we have here two examples. I hope you can see it also. It's up to the left. We have an UBL invoice XML snippet, and on the lower right is cross-industry invoice. And I've pointed out here for business term the invoice number, which in UBL is called ID. You see the characters TOSL 108, and on the right side it's also called ID under the exchange document section. Business process type and specification identifier, those are used to indicate that this particular instance, this XML file, is complying to the European norm, and it's following a specific process. And as you can see, the naming of the elements in UBL and CII is completely different, but it has the same semantic meaning in this context. Also, invoice date in UBL, the date is using the XSD built-in data type, the date data type, as you can see, with dashes between year, month, and day. While in cross-industry invoice, there are actually two alternatives on how to format dates. It's either the date time with built-in XSD data type, or the approach to using it as a character string. In the syntax binding from CEN, it's the string approach which is used. So it's a format code 102, and 102 means it's a date with a year, 4-character year, 2 month, and 2 days, without any dashes between them. So this is an example of the same semantics but different syntactical formatting. The format code is, if you're familiar with EDIFACT, this is no news to you. This is how it's also done in EDIFACT. So, and here we have another example. We are now digging into the supplier party. On the left side, we have UBL accounting supplier party, and on the right side, we have the seller trade party, that is the equivalent in cross-industry invoice. The first business term, seller identifier, as you can see, it's in UBL, it's under the party identifier. In cross-industry invoice, it's been mapped to a global ID element. In both these cases, the examples are using GS1 GLN codes. And you can see that because the scheme ID points to 0088, and that means it's GS1 who has issued the number. I don't think the actual number is valid, but anyway, that's irrelevant here. And so slightly different naming of the elements, and legal registration identifier. We can also see two different ways. In UBL, it's under legal party legal entity company ID, while in CII it's under the specified legal organization ID. The VAT number in UBL is using an approach where you have a tax scheme with the value VAT, and that points out that the company ID is a VAT number. And in cross-industry invoice, it's an attribute saying with the code VA. So here you can see that on a technical or on a usage level, it's similar or equivalent, but on an implementation level, it might be different or quite different in some cases. So for where you can find the specifications, these slides will be possible to download from the CEF Digital pages afterwards. But the UBL is the whole set, including the schemas and all supporting documentation, is found under this address, which I've had here. For the CII, it's spread out a little bit on the CEFACT web pages. The schemas are in one section, and again, I point to the SCRDM version of the schemas. For better understanding of the business requirements or the business terms level and how they are mapped to the schema, cross-industry invoice has two specifications, one called business requirement specification and one requirement specification mapping. These are two Word documents or PDF documents that gives a better understanding of the semantics behind the schemas. The schemas can in some cases be quite technical in their approach. So with that, I actually have reached the end of this webinar. So I hope you have some questions. You can either ask them out loud, or you can just put them in the chat window, and we will read them out. So I'll give you a few minutes now to provide your questions. Thank you.